All right, y'all, we are officially at 5,000 subscribers. Yay! This is so exciting for me as a creator, and I hope for those of you who have been watching and learning along the way. Now, what's exciting for me is that it's not just new faces that are subscribing to this podcast. I also happen to see the same people commenting on video after video, which makes me feel like we're actually building something better than an audience. It's actually something more of a community, which is, I think, far more valuable than just growing an audience. But I will say, I have used some principles that have allowed me to grow this community, and it's the same principles that I've used over on Instagram for my personal brand, and really how I wish I had started my very first podcast, because if I knew these principles, I think it would have saved me a lot of heartache and angst. And if you're new here, hi, I'm Huete. I'm a professional podcast producer. I've made shows like Where Should We Begin with Esther Perel and This Is Dating, which was listed as one of Time Magazine's best podcasts of 2022. I've also made shows like Far Flung for TED and also Make Me Care About for the Gates Foundation. And here is a complete list of shows that I have worked on. Now, when I first started podcasting over 8 years ago, almost a decade ago, I was an independent podcaster just like you. So I had an idea, I was working on it from my little studio apartment in New York City. And one of the hardest things for me at that time was growing an audience. It actually caused me a lot of angst and just self-doubt. And the purpose of this video is to save you from going down that same path that I went on. Now, the first principle of growing your audience is to know your people. What I mean by this is you should have a pretty clear sense of who you want to connect with through your work, okay? So this was maybe the hardest thing for me to wrap my head around when I first started, which might explain why I found it so hard to grow my podcast when I first started. Now, what I would say back then is that my podcast was for everyone. And then eventually, after a little bit of coaching and doing research and studying who was already engaging with me on Instagram, then I would say, well, my podcast is for Black women between the ages of this and this. What you really want to do, more than demographics, is to get a really clear sense of the psychology of the person that you want to connect with. And this is actually how we operate in the real world. We are friends with people whose psychology makes sense for us, whose vibe, whose values align with ours. And that's really what you want to understand about your audience. What are they struggling with? What do they like to listen to? Who are these people on a much deeper level than demographics? Now, for this channel, I make these videos for people who are really capable and want to know the facts and are good at implementing in a lot of areas in their lives, but they find themselves a little bit stuck when it comes to starting their podcast. And that might be because they are overwhelmed by all of the steps necessary or overwhelmed by the tech. They might feel a lot of self-doubt, and they might just feel like nobody really cares, or why should anybody care about their podcast? I'm really well equipped to help someone like that to go from that state to actually creating a podcast that people listen to, because I've done that for myself. So your job when you start wanting to grow an audience is to get a really clear sense on who it is that you want to connect to, and that will lead you to principle number 2. The second principle is make stuff that people want and do it with your own twist. So let's talk about the first part first. Now, you should know that before I sit down to make a video, I always do research to see whether people actually care about the thing I was sitting down to make a video about. And if they don't, I'm very quick to let that idea go and focus on a different topic. And the reason for this is you shouldn't have to recreate the wheel, right? And because this is an educational channel, it's really easy for me to intentionally make stuff that you all are already searching for. And this is not necessarily true if you're making a podcast that is more lifestyle focused or more about your own experiences. That'll be slightly different. But in my case, and I think in a lot of your cases, searching for the keywords that people might already be looking for will give you a clear sense of whether this is a topic that people care about. Now, once you do your search, you're going to see a bunch of results, and it would be very easy and very boring for you to just replicate what you see. What's far more interesting, both for you and your listener or your viewer, is for you to make your own version of that topic. So I've looked up this video, for example, how to grow your audience, and I know that this is a really searched for term. But I don't really want to make it the same way Alex Hormozi makes it or the same way Ali Abdaal makes it, because that's not who I am. That would make me no different than what you could see on their channels. The truth is, you have to use your unique advantage, your personal twist. What is the flavoring? What's the vibe you're going to bring to this, right? That is going to be really closely connected to what Ali Abdaal on YouTube here calls your unique advantage. These are the things that make you different than everyone else who's talking about the same thing. So in my particular case, I'm a podcast producer. That's a work experience. I was once a independent podcaster, and now I'm an independent creator. That's work and lived experience. And also, I am someone who has gone through the emotional roller coaster of feeling capable, feeling incapable, not being sure if my vision is going to come to life, feeling like my voice really matters. I am someone who is uniquely equipped to help that kind of person because I've had those experiences. So in your particular case, you're going to want to think about what are the lived experiences, the work experiences, even your identity, who you are and how you present to the world. All of that is going to play a role in how you connect to other people. So in my case, I'm making this video on building your audience, but it's specifically geared towards podcasters. And I'm telling you why I'm qualified to tell you about this particular subject. So you want to make stuff that people want, but you want to make sure you do it with your own twist. And that brings us to principle number 3. Playful experimentation. If you've watched this channel before, you've heard me bring this up around the concept of creative resilience. Playful experimentation is one of the core principles of creative resilience. If you haven't watched the video on creative resilience, you'll want to watch it right here. Now, this is principle number 3 in building an audience because, first of all, who doesn't like talking to, engaging with, listening to someone who is having fun, right? All of us feel this way. When we see someone experiencing joy or living in alignment with what they should be doing, we automatically gravitate towards them. So part of your job while you are working on your podcast is to really bring your joy, bring your life, bring your energy to it. The second reason this is so important is because if you're not having fun in the process, sweetie, this is not sustainable. You're going to wear out, you're going to be tired, you're not going to want to do this thing. So in order for it to actually be sustainable and something that you consistently do, you want to infuse as much fun and play and experimentation into it as possible. This also keeps you from being a perfectionist about things, and it allows you to put out your best work at that particular moment and then let it go and then work on the next piece or the next episode that you're going to work on, okay? So in my case, I do a few things to make sure that I am experimenting playfully, that I'm bringing joy into the process. One of those things is I actually will usually have a friend that I'm co-working with on a screen right over here. And if I'm not doing that, then I'm playing music beforehand and just loosening up, or I call a friend who I have fun with, who I laugh with before I sit down to record. All of that is going to allow me to show up and connect with you from a much better state than if I was really in a grumpy mood after a really hard meeting. So that's something that you really want to think about as much as you can. Try and regulate yourself and have some fun and playful energy when you come to sit down and work on this creative endeavor, because ultimately you're not going to be able to sustain it unless you have an air of playful experimentation with this whole thing. Now, all of that being said, it doesn't mean that I'm not going to show up and do the work even if I'm having a bad day. And I'll tell you this, I've recorded these videos on the worst days and on the best days. And the reason for that is because I made a commitment to myself, and I know that if I don't follow through, I will feel really frustrated with myself. And that's just going to be a spiral. And I don't want to go down that path. So I just stay on the path that I've created for myself. Now, this brings us to principle number 4, which is be consistent on the right things. Now, what I hear online often is people telling you, you got to show up day in, day out. You got to do the thing. You got to stay. You got to hustle. And I'm here to tell you that I have followed that advice. I have, there have been months where I've made stuff on Instagram every single day, or months when I was creating my own podcast where I would publish something every single week. But because I wasn't actually getting better week over week, episode over episode, it really wasn't that fulfilling. And in your case, I would really encourage you to be consistent on the right things first. What I mean by this is, first, get really clear on who your people are and get really clear on whether the content you're making for them is actually content that they want. Okay, so if you are a podcaster, you're new to the game, one of the best things you can do is actually go out and speak to the people that you think you want to connect with and tell them, I'm thinking about starting this kind of podcast. What kinds of episodes would you like to see? And then you can actually go out and make those episodes. If you don't do that, but you're just creating week over week, it's a recipe for frustration. And I'm telling you this because I have been there. Because I refused to get clear on who my people were, I found myself really frustrated when I would create podcast episodes but didn't find that my audience was growing. So don't be like me and actually be consistent on figuring out the right things and then improve 1% on every single episode. The second part to being consistent that you have to remember is that consistency and patience go hand in hand. Another way of saying this is consistency without patience is a futile act, okay? The reason I'm telling you this is because I don't care how consistent you are. Unless you give it time, you're not going to see the results that you want to see. And I am not a very naturally patient person, so this was maybe the hardest lesson for me to learn. And to be fair, the older I got, the easier it got to be consistent, I guess because life just taught me to be more patient. If you're creating something and expecting external validation from it from jump, it's going to be really, really frustrating. So I really encourage you to, when you're practicing consistency, remember that the other end of consistency is patience, and they need to go hand in hand. If you're not practicing both, it's going to be a very frustrating journey for you. And one of the ways that you can practice consistency is to get support in the areas where you know you struggle with the most, or where it takes up the most time. In my case, I got support in the form of an editor from day one. Now, I will say, for me, even though I knew how to edit video and I've edited audio for years, I knew that this is the piece of the puzzle that takes me the longest amount of time. And because I'm running a business and making these YouTube videos, it just felt like it would be taking up a lot of time and it would be the barrier between me and consistency. So I hired an editor. Now, that's what getting support looked like for me. For you, support might actually look like hiring an editor, but it could also be that you need help becoming a better storyteller, or learning how to better identify your audience, or really getting clear on what each of the steps are to creating your podcast so that you can actually create a show that builds your thought leadership and then eventually leads to becoming something that you can monetize. If that sounds like you will want to download the 10-step guide to launching your podcast. This will enroll you into our mailing list, and you'll be the first to know when the Emerging Voices Accelerator applications open up again. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What is it that you have found to be the most effective ways of growing your audience, if you have started growing your audience already? And I just want to thank you for rocking with me this far, and I can't wait to see you in the next video.